My question is, I was just doing my studying today. I was reading through, and I first off want to admit I understand that we're under a new covenant. We're no longer under the law, but Romans 13:8 kind of just challenged my thinking a little bit, and I guess I wanted to get your take on it. In which it says, owe no one anything except to love each other. For the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. And then as it goes down to verse 10, it says, love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, is this referring to Jesus or God being love and he's fulfilling the law? Or is this, I'm not imagining this is like a commandment or a rule that we need to follow, but I understand it is good to love one another,
Mm-hmm.
but I guess I'm just getting
Yeah.
confused with maybe the terms fulfilled and commandment. Maybe if you could share some insight on that, Andrew.
Sure, Dan. Thank you. Good question. Well, first of all, you started in verse 8. It says, let no debt remain outstanding. So everybody out there would naturally say, well, is it okay for me to have a mortgage? Is it okay for me to have a credit card? And a lot of people try to take some sort of stance on those things based on this passage. Well, it's pretty clear that's not what's going on here. First of all, he's talking about not getting in trouble with the government. He's talking about paying taxes. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. And then if you owe revenue, that is, if you've hired someone and they've done a job for you and you're withholding their pay, then make sure you pay them. So this is not to be applied today and just, telling people they can never have any sort of debt, that that's a sin or anything like that. This passage does not mean that. In fact, the whole thing is couched in love, as you correctly identified. I mean, is it loving to not pay someone when they've done a job for you? Well, of course not. So he's saying, do the loving thing. If you owe them respect, respect them. If you owe them honor, well, honor them. So that's what he means when he says, let no debt remain outstanding except the continuing debt to love one another, for one who loves has fulfilled the law. Well, that doesn't change what he's already said. I mean, remember, this is the epistle to the Romans, and in Romans 7, he said, you, my brothers, were made to die to the law so that you might live to God. And he goes on to give an analogy of dying and then, being able to be remarried and all that stuff. And so from Romans 7, we gather that our relationship with the Jewish law should be that we're dead to it. From Galatians, he tells us we're not supposed to be under it. From Romans, he says Christ is the end of the law for all those who believe. So it's certainly appropriate for you to be asking, well, then, what are these things doing here? What are these quotes from the Old Testament doing here in Romans 13? And I think he's setting a precedent. He's saying that God has always been about love. When God says don't commit adultery, why did he say that? Well, because it's not very loving for you to cheat on your spouse. Well, when he says don't murder, why would God say that? Of all the things he could have prohibited, why did he prohibit murder? Well, because it's not loving to kill somebody. And you could go through all these things. Is it loving to steal someone's stuff? Is it loving to want other people's possessions and to seek to take them? I mean, that's not love. And so God is love. And so he is using the Old Testament to set a precedent to say that God is love, and love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love, when you look at 613 laws, really the fulfillment of all of that is if we trust Christ today and let him love people in and through us. So, there's tons of quotes from the Old Testament in the New Testament. And most of the time, Paul, Peter, James, and John are quoting from the Old in order to set a precedent. Maybe it's a characteristic of God, of who he is and his character. In this case, that would certainly be going on, that the characteristic of God here is his love. And he was love in the Old Testament, and he's love in the New Testament, and he will never change. And so, with that in mind, the Apostle Paul is talking about God's attribute of being love, and then he's showing how that can be played out in relationships with the government. You don't think of loving the government very much, but I think he's also talking about staying out of trouble. Stay out of trouble with the government. Pay honor to them if they need to be honored. Give respect to them if they need to be respected. And then employees that you've hired, give them the pay that is due them if you owe them money. This sort of thing, he's saying, are expressions of love, expressions of respect and honor, and these are traits of who God is, and therefore they're traits of who Christ is living in us today. So he's using the old to set a precedent for God's character. It doesn't change his theology about Christians being dead to the law, not under the law, and Christ is the end of the law for all those who believe. But we also better believe that if we've got Christ living in us, he is going to desire to love in and through us. Dan, thanks for your question. It was a good one. Call back anytime.